Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's graphics card performance comparison. We are testing three different graphics cards today. The Asus Republic of Gamers Strix GTX 1060 6GB card, the same card but in the 1070 version, and the EVGA for the Win 1080 graphics card. So we have a 1060, a 1070, and a 1080 all being tested in the same computer today. All three cards are in the $1,500 i7-7700k custom-built computer that I've previously done an entire video series on. There will be a link in the video description below if you'd like to know more about that computer, what's in it, how it's configured. Check that out. It's an amazing machine. 16 gigabytes of DDR3 3200 megahertz RAM, and it's overclocked to 5 gigahertz. We are testing today at two resolutions, 1440p and 2160p, otherwise known as 4K. At 1440p, which will be all tested first, we are at very high detail with anti-aliasing turned on. At 2160p or 4K, we're at high detail with anti-aliasing turned off. I don't believe anti-aliasing is necessary when you're running at 4K resolution on the average monitor size. The pixel density is so sharp, I just don't think it's necessary, but that's a personal preference. VSync is off for all the runs. The run that we're watching right now is the GTX 1060, 1440p, very high detail. Take a look at the MSI Afterburner numbers in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Our GPU usage, the first percentage up there, we're basically using all of it. We're very graphics card limited, running at 1440p on a 1060, but it runs very, very well. 54 degrees Celsius, very reasonable temperature. Our fan speed is very reasonable at just 1300 RPM, and take a look at our clock speed, straight at 2 gigahertz. Please note, none of these cards have been overclocked by me. These are all GPU boost in operation. These are factory overclocked cards, but not to this extent. These cards did not come, ouch, that hurt, ouch, pain, ouch. These cards did not come at 2 gigahertz from the factory, but that is NVIDIA's GPU boost working. Very cool auto overclocking. Take a look at line 2, our VRAM usage. Now this is a 6 gigabyte card. You can also get a GTX 1060 with 3 gigabytes of VRAM. I have done an extensive video talking about the differences between 3 and 6 gigabytes and who should consider them. In short, if you're playing at 1080p resolution, I think the 3 gigabyte card is just fine. There's no reason to spend the extra money for the 6. However, if you are going to run at 1440p resolution or 4K, I would get the 6 gigabyte card. On the other hand, I would make a strong argument for simply buying the GTX 1070. Here's a thought for you. This particular 6 gig card, this Asus Republic of Gamers Strix card, is a $300 card. It's very, very nice. Take a look at this. We are at 90 frames per second at very high detail at 1440p resolution. But for $100 more, you can have the 1070 version of this same card. For $100 more, you get about 50% faster compute performance out of the card. You will see the difference at the end of the video when I show you the side-by-side. I think the 1060 is a great card when you can find it for $250 or less. At $300, I think it's a bit rich for what it gives you because you're so close to the price of the 1070. Having said that, there are less expensive 1060s on the market. You don't have to get this particular one. This is a triple fan cooler. It's got RGB lighting. It's a very, very, very nice card. It's very quiet. So it's a premium price card, but it is a premium product. Regardless, 90 frames per second. This plays perfectly. What can you say? At 1440p, GTA 5 plays wonderfully. Looking at our CPU usage, we're right at about 50%. Now it bounces above it and below it depending upon what's going on the screen. In general, in most situations, an i5 will play games just fine. You don't need an i7. When we're at 50% usage on this i7, that basically means we're using our 4 cores. We're not into our hyperthreading. Now, that is starting to change. I do believe that if you're on the extreme end of gaming, if you really want to play at 1440p or 4K, especially newer titles, which Grand Theft Auto 5 really isn't, it's actually a year and a half old on the PC, an i7 is definitely worth considering. That being said, most games really do in fact still play fine on an i5, and GTA 5 is one of them. Main system RAM usage, 8 gigs would be enough, but it is smoother, especially transitioning between areas on 16 gigs of RAM, most notably clean test machine. There's nothing else on this computer. Load up a couple of background apps, have a web browser or two open, and it would not be at 6.8 gigabytes. So I still recommend 16 gigs of RAM for gaming in 2016. And as I said, look at our frame rate. It just couldn't be any better considering what this card is and considering the resolution and detail we're running at. I'm impressed. All right, let's take a look at this same game, same settings, same resolution on the 1070. And here we are on the GTX 1070. Again, all the same settings, 1440p, very high detail, but our frame rate will be much improved. Well, except for this initial part where I blow up all of these comments. Boom, that's just oh, that's entirely too much fun. What can I say? That'll get the cops after you. Take a look at our CPU usage and take a look at our main system RAM usage as this particular playthrough advances. Because we have a faster graphics card, we actually need more CPU power. I just got done telling you on the GTX 1060 that it rarely went above 50% and you didn't really need more than an i5 to take advantage of your graphics chip. Now we have about 50% more graphics power. Hang on, ouch, I don't know what I was thinking, what can I say? We have 50% more graphics power. To use that graphics power and get a higher frame rate, the system now has to draw the environment and the world much faster because our frame rate is going to be higher. Take a look at our CPU usage, 68%, 67%. We are now into hyperthreading. We would not be getting this same frame rate on an i5. Because we have so much graphics performance available, we actually need extra CPU power in order to display the world. Now, this will drop down a bit as you increase the resolution and lower your frame rate. High frame rate gaming, if you have a 100 or 144 hertz monitor, a high powered CPU is just as important as a high powered graphics chip in order to take advantage of that high frame rate monitor. Take a look at our main system RAM. We're just at 8 gigabytes of RAM. If we had 8 gigs of RAM in the system instead of 16, it would run fine, but it wouldn't be as smooth. The minimums would be lower than they actually are because of stuttering, because Windows would be swapping information from the main system RAM out to the swap file and back. Ooh, that's gotta hurt. Well, good thing it's not real and it's a video game, and crash, boom. There we go. Let's go cause some mayhem and destruction in the city, shall we? Thank goodness it's not my car. I just trimmed about 4 minutes of gameplay out. Take a look at the main system RAM usage. We are up to 8.7 gigabytes. This will continue to climb. I actually tested each one of these cards for about 30 minutes. I've got about 3 hours of recorded gameplay across the various runs that I did here. Actually, one of them is a little bit more than that because I did some bonus footage, but the RAM usage creeps as you drive around the city and accumulate damage and events and etc. The game's keeping track of what's going on. So it's very easy to look. If I just ran the game's built-in benchmark, you wouldn't see things like that. But when you actually spend 30 minutes driving around the city and you see the RAM count increase as you're driving around, this is why I keep suggesting it. I know people say, but it runs fine. It does when you just test it and run 5 minutes or do the built-in benchmark. Look at that, we're at 9.1 gigabytes. I'm not doing anything but driving around the city. I'm not even advancing the story, which would use even more. Again, nothing running in the background. Test machine, very, very clean. The only thing we've got going is MSI Afterburner, Fraps, and the game. Another cut. A few minutes later, dusk is starting to set, and now we're up to about 10 gigabytes of system RAM usage. Now our CPU usage has actually dropped off a bit because we're outside of the city, and our frame rate has dropped. Interestingly enough, at nighttime, Grand Theft Auto 5's frame rate does appear to be a bit lower than it is during the day. All 3 of my runs at 1440p and all 3 of my runs at 2160p included both day and night time. I tried to run them at the same time of day and night through a 30-minute cycle to make them as consistent as possible. I also split them between countryside driving on the freeway and driving in the city to try to balance it out as much as I could. I was really working to make this as fair as I possibly could. Now, in random driving such as this, it's never going to be exact. That's what the built-in benchmark is for. But the built-in benchmark is not long enough or detailed enough to really stress these kind of machines. There we are, we're at 57, we were at 61% CPU usage, and there's not even that much on the screen. Get inside the city and play for a while, and it makes a big difference. And here we are on the GTX 1080. Now the GTX 1080 is not 50% faster than the 1070 the way the 1070 is 50% faster than the 1060. In reality, it's somewhere between 20 to 30% faster depending upon the specific circumstances, game, etc. However, if you look at the real-time frame rate, you will notice there is a noticeable difference. We just touched at 140 frames per second there a minute ago. Now it's back down to in the mid 120s. But it is a noticeable change if you're on a high refresh rate monitor. If you're running something such as the 144Hz 1440p Asus Republic of Gamers monitor, for example, yes, you really should have a 1080, and yes, you really should have a i7, because frankly, you need to throw everything in the world at such a monitor and refresh rate if you want to play games at 144 frames per second at 1440p. In fact, in many games, you'll need two 1080s or at least two 1070s to get that kind of performance. Grand Theft Auto 5, as I mentioned before, is about a year and a half old on the PC. I know it's closer to 3 years older on the consoles, but on the PC, it's just over a year and a half old. But if you want to play Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Dishonored 2, the new For Honor, if you want to play Ghost Recon Wildlands, you're going to need to basically throw all the compute and all the CPU power at it you can to run at 1440p at 144 frames per second. That is very demanding. To put it another way, 144 frames per second at 1440p is more demanding in most respects than 4K at 60 Hz. So you need a lot to make that work, and not just GPU power, but CPU power. So basically, how much money do you have in order to have that kind of gaming experience? Interestingly enough, some people have commented on how expensive those monitors can be. You can easily spend $700 to $1,000 on a high refresh rate 1440p monitor, a good one. But you're going to spend more than that on the computer to run it. So $800 for a really nice monitor, $1,500 for the computer to run it. Now that may sound expensive, and it is, especially when you consider that if you're okay with 1080p high refresh rate gaming, you can spend a lot less money and get similar performance. But yeah, you know, spend more, get more. It's how it is. Now I'm going to skip ahead here. This is the same run, the same playthrough, but this was, 10 minutes later or so. We're at night. I actually managed to steal one of the police's helicopters. He made the mistake of landing on the ground, and I managed to nick it. This is a cool shot as we fly over what is supposed to be, I suppose, the Santa Monica Pier. The real one is much bigger, but take a look at that. How cool is that? I just had to include that. Now, having included that, I'm going to include another shot. Now, this is a lot of fun. This just takes a minute, but give it a chance because it's quite funny. So here we are flying in the helicopter over the airport. That's good, we'll land here. Excuse me, kind sir, can I please borrow that oh, you're so kind to come to a stop for me. That is a lovely airplane. It even says, my fly. So give it to me and I'll fly it. Oop, these cop cars. They wouldn't be so stupid as to run into... Oh, hey, good thing my airplane is nice and strong and can... Really? Seriously? Fine. I'll steal your police car, Mr. Policeman, and we'll just drive across the place, and who wants to guess what's coming next? If you guessed that, yes, you guessed correctly. Now, we're just going to borrow this. I'm sure no one will mind, and I'm sure it's as easy as running right up to it. I'm just going to borrow it for a minute, I swear. Runway? I don't have clearance to take off from the runway? All right, I won't. I'll take off from the grass. I'm sure 747s can do that just fine. Well, maybe this one can. So let's get this thing in the air. If you do steal a 747, keep in mind the cops spend a minute or two shooting at it from every angle and direction, and if you look at the right engine, you'll see it smoking. Usually you won't get very far in this thing unless you repair it, and we're repaired and in the sky, and the city at night is... Look at this. This is gorgeous. The detail, the amount that you can see on the streets, the lighting effects on the streets, and the fact that we're still getting 155, almost 160 frames per second at very high detail at 1440p. This is absolutely gorgeous. Now, I'm going to trim a ton of this out. That's gorgeous. I have no words for how pretty that is. I just can't wait to Grand Theft Auto 6. I hope they just completely outdo themselves. I took the airplane on an entire circuit of the island. I flew up, I had some fun. We're going to come around here, and I am going to show you something that I've tried multiple times, and this might have actually been my first successful attempt to do it. We're going to land this airplane, but not at the airport. Where are we going to land? Are we going to land on the highway? That'll be tough with all the light poles and trees. Are we going to land on the mountain? Nah, it'd probably blow up there. We just lowered our landing gear. Are we going to land in the water? Nah, the plane would just crash. Where are we going to land? There actually aren't many places in the Grand Theft Auto 5 world that you can land a 747. That, however, is one of them. And I'm not even landing lengthwise on the beach. I'm landing straight towards the buildings. Some people are partially committed. That's fully committed. What do you think of that landing? Okay, enough playing around. Now we're going to switch to the 4K or 2160p benchmarks. Here we are back on the GTX 1060 graphics card. High detail, I'm showing you what it looks like right now so you know exactly the settings that I had checked. And then we're going to go see how well this performs. Again, I started off with a nice big collection of comments because, what can I say, it's entirely too much fun. Let's blow those up and move on. Oh, take a look at the numbers in the upper left-hand corner. Now, our GPU usage, of course, is going to be 100% because we're running at 4K resolution at high detail. Look at the bottom at our real-time frame rate. Now, that's a ridiculous amount of cars exploding at the moment, and we're still doing 50 frames per second. Now, this particular section right here is not a normal situation, so ignore the frame rate for the moment. This isn't important. Instead, let's see what it's like when we're actually driving around. Alright, I'm going to skip ahead here and show you more of the intermediate section of play. You can see how lovely I've treated that car for several minutes. Put my painkiller back on because it's been a couple of minutes and it's worn itself off, and we'll go steal ourselves another car. Nope, don't want that one. That one looks slow. That one's ugly. Here we go. We'll take a four-wheel drive. I'm sure that will work out well for us. I love how you just smash the window with your elbow. I don't know about you, but I think my elbow would hurt after smashing a car window. Those things are pretty tough. And we've been completely stopped by a park bench. Good to know those things are built so tough. They are built to last. And apparently a four-wheel drive truck cannot climb these stairs. How sad is that? Okay, focus back to the performance, or this will turn into a Let's Play video if I'm not careful. GPU usage, again, is still at 99%. Our VRAM usage is at about 4.6 gigabytes. Our CPU usage is remarkably low, but that's for the section that we're in. We're at the airport again. You know, I don't remember. Did I steal an airplane in this? I filmed this a couple of days ago, and I might have. Yes, I did. Okay, I paused that and looked, and here we are because I cut a whole section of the video out. How much? Take a look at what's behind me, and I'll let you guess how much got taken out, because there's currently a 747 straddling the road. Okay, there's a whole section of flying, and the reason I cut it out is simply because I just showed you the one in the previous take on the GTX 1080. There was no point in showing you that again. That's not really part of the gameplay, and so here we are. Take a look at our frame rate. There's a 747 sitting across the road. We've got about 8 gigabytes of our VRAM used. Our CPU is quite respectable at about 32-37%. Keep something in mind. I said earlier at high frame rates, when we were on the 1080 at 120 to 140 frames per second, our CPU was into 5 and 6 cores. The i7 was making a difference. The i5 here would be fine, but that's because our frame rate is down in the 60s. At 4K, we are now completely GPU limited and the CPU doesn't matter as much. Many times I get asked all the time in comments in YouTube videos, beneath YouTube videos saying, will this graphics card bottleneck that CPU, or will this CPU bottleneck that graphics card? It is never that simple, and this is a perfect example of why. At 1440p on a GTX 1080, an i5 will bottleneck it in Grand Theft Auto 5. But at 4K, it won't necessarily bottleneck it because we are GPU limited and not CPU limited. So if your question is, will X bottleneck Y? That depends. What game, what resolution, what detail setting, what frame rate are you going for? It's never as simple as X and Y will bottleneck each other or won't. So you have to look at the particulars. I will say that in general, high frame rates need high CPU. High resolutions and high detail need high graphics, but that is in general, not in always, and it depends upon the game and the situation. You generally can't go wrong with more performance in either regard, but you are usually limited by one or the other. You're limited by either your CPU. Well, look at that. I'm awful. Can you believe that? Oh, the police need to stop me. I'm just terrible. I shot all of them. You are usually limited by either your CPU or your graphics card, not by both. Right now, our graphics card is at 100% and our CPU is at 34%. So we're using 3 of our 4 real processing cores, and we're not even touching the hyper-threading. So an i7 right now would make absolutely zero difference to performance whatsoever, but that wasn't true at 1440p with the 1080. Now the interesting thing will be to take a look at the 1080 at 4K and see whether or not we go above 50% on our CPU, or are we still GPU limited. Let's take a look at the GTX 1070. What can I say? Do I love to pile my comments up, or do I love to pile my... That's the little boy in me who's having too much fun with his army figures. Okay, enough of that, back to benchmarking. I want to quickly draw your attention to the 4th line, 16 gigabytes of RAM. You will notice we're using 10.5 gigabytes of it. Now that's not normal when you first launch the game into a save game file and you start driving around. I sit down and record multiple of these at different resolutions to use at different times. While the 1440p file that I ended up using in this video was at very high detail, I also recorded one at high detail. Now switching from high to very high forces the game to restart. However, I can record, and I did, a 1080p, a 1440p, and a 4K at the same detail settings by just changing the resolution, reloading the save game file, and launching anew. It saves a lot of time to sit down and record all of the different videos that I may need back to back to back, rather than doing them one at a time, because you have to change out the graphics card and change the settings and relaunch the game and so on and so forth. I bring this up because this is representative of an hour of play, actually more like an hour and a half to be honest, because I was goofing off and playing around with it, but this is more than an hour into the game actually loaded and running, and we are at 11.5 gigabytes of RAM. So for everybody who says, but you only need 8 gigabytes of RAM, yes, for benchmarking and just for loading it up, you do. But if you want to play at high resolution, high detail settings in open world games such as Grand Theft Auto 5, there is absolutely zero excuse whatsoever to not have 16 gigs of RAM installed. If you're playing at 1440p, if you've got a $400 to $600 graphics card, you should have 16 gigs of RAM. If you're running at 8 gigs of RAM and you have a $400 graphics card, in my opinion, you did it wrong. But that's me, and you can do your computer any way you want. Okay, I just cut about another 5 minutes of gameplay out. Take a look at our main system RAM usage, 12.5 gigabytes. It creeps up over time. Now, some of that may be a memory leak in the game itself. If you are RAM limited, I suggest every 2 hours or so, saving your progress, closing the game client, rebooting your machine, and then launching it again, and you'll free up all that RAM. You'll free up the resources of what it was. Ow, that hurt. Now, look at our CPU usage, line 3. We don't need an i7 in this particular case. An overclocked i5 would do just as good a job. That is an awful... Am I really going to steal that piece of junk? Okay, fine, I guess so. Our VRAM usage is about 5 gigabytes, and look at our frame rate. We're at 90 frames a second. We're playing at 4K 2160p resolution at high detail on a GTX 1070, which isn't really sold or meant to be a 4K card, but you know, Grand Theft Auto 5 is a year and a half old. It does pretty well, and we're rocking nearly 100 frames per second. That's pretty cool. 3 more minutes of footage cut out, and now we're at 13.5 gigabytes, and we're at about 75 frames per second. The sun is starting to set. Boy, I didn't even get away before that. Look at all the blood on that car. That's just awful. I will say our frame rate's still amazing. We're still at about 70. Ooh, am I going to make it? Ouch, that hurt. Ooh, my kids are going to feel that. Hopefully I had my seatbelt on. And can I find something else fun to steal? Ooh, what about that? What about that? Ooh. Oh, that's kind of cool. Is that a Dodge Viper? I think we'll steal that. Excuse me, you don't... They're shooting up that very nice car. How am I supposed to fence it and turn it in for parts if it's all shot up with the... I'll bet you that door's expensive. Okay. Now we're going to take a look at the 1080. Many people consider the GTX 1080 to be the perfect 4K graphics card. I am not one of them, although it will do just fine here. A common thing that I've heard is GTX 1060 for 1080p, a 1070 for 1440p, and a 1080 for 4K. The only problem with that is 1080p is 2 million pixels, 1440p is 3.6 million, but 4K is 8.3 million. A 1080 is actually more appropriate for a 1440p ultra-wide, the 34-inch 3440 by 1440p monitors. Those monitors have 5 million pixels, 1.4 million more than a standard 16 by 9 1440p screen. It actually is a fairly decent jump in the pixel count on the screen. So given the performance increase, if you have a standard 1440p, a 1070 graphics card is a good choice. If you have an ultra-wide, one of the 21 by 9 1440p monitors, then a 1080 would be an excellent choice. For 4K gaming, now Grand Theft Auto 5 actually plays fine at 4K, but again, it's not a brand new game. If you want to play Assassin's Creed Syndicate, if you want to play the new For Honor game, if you want to play the 2016 and 2017 games at higher ultra detail at 4K, you really need two of these graphics cards. It's very expensive to do. We'll get there. The next generation of cards will do it. I don't even know if the rumored 1080 Ti is really going to be enough. Many people often like to joke and say that you need one of the Titan XPs, the Titan X card with the Pascal chip. Even it's not really powerful enough to do 4K in many modern games, certainly not at ultra detail. Yeah, if you turn them down, it's not bad. But it might be another year before we see graphics cards that can really do 4K properly. Of course, keep in mind that new games will keep coming out that have even more demanding graphics that just require even more graphics performance. Being on the leading or bleeding edge is expensive. How much money do you have and how badly do you want to play at 4K? Side note, I actually own two GTX 1080s. I put two 1080s into SLI into my 4K machine, the one with the i7-7800k 6-core 12-thread CPU. I tested a few games, I played a few games. It works well in games that support SLI. The problem is when you run into games that don't. Rise of the Tomb Raider, for example, doesn't support SLI at all. Grand Theft Auto 5 does perfectly. It's absolutely incredible. Set everything to max and you get like 1 billion frames per second. But when it doesn't support it, it's like having one card or worse. You have to turn it on and off. I actually took the 1080 out of, or one of the two 1080s out of that machine, and that's what I'm using to test on my test bench. My computer only has one 1080 in it at the moment, and the reason for that is because I'm just playing at 1440p. Please note, I have a very nice 4K monitor. I have a 32-inch Acer IPS 4K monitor on that computer, and yet I set my games to 1440p. I can turn the graphics detail up, the performance is smooth, it runs really nicely, and I don't have to have $1,200 worth of graphics cards in order just to play a computer game. Can I see the difference between 1440p and 4K on a 32-inch monitor? Yes, kinda, sorta. To be honest with you, it's not that big. Once you get into the game, once you start playing, it's minor. I am less impressed by 4K than I thought I would when I first got the 4K monitors. It's nice for editing YouTube videos, for browsing the web, for putting up Microsoft Office documents, for being able to see text. 4K is awesome. I wouldn't trade 4K for anything when it comes to productivity applications. For ow, that hurt. For games, it's nice, but ultra detail at 1440p is often much better looking than medium detail at 4K. Yes, you get sharper lines, but you give up all the textures and lighting and everything else to get there. So unless you have all the money in the world to spend on fancy expensive graphics cards, my advice for most people, 1440p is the sweet spot. If you can afford a 1070 or a 1080, I would skip 4K unless you just have money to throw at it. Ow, that hurt. Okay. Now, as far as 4K goes, It's an uneven experience. Take a look at our frame rate. We're at 100 frames per second at high detail. Now, I did record one of these at very high detail on this card in 4K. It did not quite average 60 frames per second, but it was close. But the minimums dipped quite a bit. Having this at very high detail at 4K on a single 1080, the minimum dips were unacceptable. This is why I decided to settle on high detail, because it's almost not quite perfect. Put two 1080s, as I can tell you from experience, perfect 100%, no issues. Okay, that's enough of my random thoughts for one day. Why don't we actually go look at some results? Here we are at the first set of results. I'm going to do these separately. 1440p, 1060, 1070, 1080. An average of 80, 106, and 129 frames per second. A minimum of 45, 71, and 97, and a max of 110, 161, and 188. The takeaway from this is Grand Theft Auto 5 actually plays fine at 1440p on a GTX 1060. Please note, it has to be a 6GB card. We were using 4.5GB of VRAM, or if you have a high refresh rate, 100Hz or 144Hz monitor, then step up to a 1070 or a 1080. Please note that your CPU does matter. Now, in this particular case, we have all the CPU power in the world. You can't get much higher than this. If you have a slower CPU, whether or not you see lower performance is going to depend upon your frame rate. If you're playing at 60 frames per second, it's not going to matter. If you have a high refresh rate display, 100 to 144 Hz, get a high clock speed i7. That's my recommendation. What about 4K? A $300 GTX 1060 3GB averaged 59 frames per second. Sweet, right? Yes, but look at the minimum, 37. It's absolutely totally playable, but it's not perfectly smooth. However, spend $100 more, and for about $400 for a GTX 1070, you can have a minimum of 57 frames per second, an average of 83, and a max of 109. If you have a 4K 60Hz display and you have a GTX 1070 on high detail, Grand Theft Auto 5 will rock perfectly smoothly. Want a little bit more buffer? Want to crank a couple details up? Get a 1080 and it will also play perfectly smoothly. Final point, and just let me be clear, this is one of the better case scenarios. I am going to be testing other games, newer games, in the coming week, including games such as Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Dishonored 2, and so on. They're not going to show results like this, so keep in mind if you're thinking, great, I can game at 4K on a 1070, yes, in Grand Theft Auto 5. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below this video, questions and comments below the video, and as always, check out the video description below. A link to my full playlist on the $1,500 i7 computer build is down there, all the details on that computer, a link to my reviews on the 1060, 1070, and 1080 are down there as well, and links to Amazon and Newegg for the 3 cards I showed you in this video, and to all of the 1060, 70, and 80 cards on Amazon and Newegg. If you found my video useful or helpful in any way and you want to help me out, then go shop at Amazon and Newegg because they have awesome prices and they have awesome customer service, and everything you saw in this video was bought from those 2 stores, so I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video.